Nicole Shanahan is, in many respects, a classic American success story. She grew up in poverty, worked her way through college and law school, including by working in various hourly jobs like a maid and a paralegal, and is now a 38-year-old, highly respected lawyer in Silicon Valley. She is also one of the richest women in the world with an estimated net worth of $1 billion that is largely, though not entirely, a result of her marriage to Google co-founder Sergey Brin. But most notable of all, she is now the running mate of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and if polls are even remotely correct, they will likely be the most meaningful and significant independent presidential candidacy in many years. She's an extremely interesting person with a very rich and I would say vintage American life, and she also has a robust political trajectory, and we are delighted to welcome her tonight to System Update. Ms. Shanahan, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. And just a quick correction, my mom was a maid, but my first job was bussing tables, and I just wanted to...
Yeah, I appreciate that. I apologize for that mistake. But the story that is true, that you did grow up without any advantages, essentially in poverty, had to work your way through college and law school and build up what you became, which I think everybody can and should respect. All right, let me start off by asking you about just a couple of, I think, crucial issues, including the two wars that our country is currently financing and arming and supporting. The first one is in Ukraine. When I had RFK Jr. on my show several months ago, we spent a lot of time talking about his view on that war. And since then, the war has gotten even worse from the perspective of the Ukrainians. I think it's a consensus that the Ukrainian military is in deep trouble, that the Russians are advancing, that the idea that they could ever expel Ukrainian troops, Russian troops from all of Ukraine is a pipe dream that will never happen. Do you support the ongoing financing by the U.S. government of the war in Ukraine? And if not, what do you think should be done to try and bring about a resolution?
Well, first of all, this war should have never happened. The United States should have never egged it on as it has. The U.S. has been involved in Ukrainian affairs for decades now. We've been involved in their elections and have been pushing certain kinds of candidates that have been anti-Russia and anti-normalization of relationships and trade relationships with Russia. And so the moment that we're in right now, watching Ukrainians' lives lost at incredible rates, young men getting dragged into duty who have no interest in fighting and risking their lives. You have the will of the people wanting peace with Russia in this moment. I was devastated when the foreign aid bill went out, sending an additional, I believe it was $70 billion to finance this war. In this moment, I think that it is imperative for the United States to understand what is going on. The United States has intentionally aggravated a situation, has continued to escalate it, is looking at deploying troops, has allowed the Ukrainian military to use U.S. Military supplies. I mean, this is every day there's a new escalation that it's taking us to a point of World War III scale risk for our people, and we need to think about what our job is right now, and our job is to take care of this country and to not escalate foreign wars.
So with regard to that last argument, that our job as a country, the government's duty, it seems so basic, but for whatever reason it has to be debated because so often it's not done. But the idea is, as you said, that the U.S. government's primary duty is to take care of our citizens here at home. Our citizens are suffering. Communities are being ravaged by all kinds of pathologies. People are in economic difficulty. And so, as you say, why should we be sending $60 billion to Ukraine to fuel a war that is highly futile? I want to know whether you apply that same line of thinking, that same rationale, to the billions and billions of dollars that we're sending to Israel to finance and arm its war against Gaza, one that has resulted in more civilian casualties by a long distance than the one in Ukraine.
I think that the U.S. sending funds to Israel to support the Iron Dome makes a lot of sense. I've supported that in the past. I think historically it's been a great way to show support for the state of Israel. I believe October 7th was one of the worst terrorist attacks I've witnessed in my lifetime. Might be the worst terrorist attacks I will witness in my lifetime. And I do think a response was warranted. I think that when I think about Israel participating in wars of the past and the role that the United States played, I often think of leadership like Golda Meir, who ended the Yom Kippur War in about a month. And she was fighting on multiple fronts against multiple armies. And what I see right now happening on the ground in Gaza is devastating. I think that, there's arguments to be made that we've long passed the point of a ceasefire. I think there's lots of arguments to be made that Israel should be showing more restraint. And there's very strong arguments. And, Bobby and I, this is one of the areas that we have the most heated debate. And I think that there's an argument that the United States should have delivered the last aid package to Israel with greater affirmation as to how that money would be spent. And we're in a moment right now that I really don't think we should have been in. And you have to go back historically to really look at the United States' involvement in the Middle East. There's a direct line between our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and Hamas. Israel feels that, and many people will agree, that a two-state system is not possible in a world in which Hamas is running Gaza. And I tend to agree with that, but is it possible or likely that the Israeli military is going to be successful in destroying Hamas in totality in this moment? I don't think so. And I think that was actually clear as early as February. And so I think that in this moment, the United States really needs to take responsibility for what it's done in arriving to this moment. And I do think that there needs to be greater coordination, greater levels of sophistication in how we're operating ourselves in the Middle East in this moment.
So when you began, you started talking about funding the Iron Dome, which is a purely defensive system that prevents Israel from being attacked with rockets and other types of missiles. But we're not just funding that. We're, of course, funding all their offensive weapons. Most of the bombs being dropped on civilians in Gaza have made in the USA on them, and the whole world knows that. I guess what I'm wondering is the advocates of U.S. financing of the war in Ukraine will say, we're not helping Ukraine conquer territory. We're not helping Ukraine invade other countries. It's basically like an Iron Dome. We're just giving them money to defend their country against aggression and invasion by the Russians. What is the difference between Ukraine on the one hand and Israel on the other, in your view, when it comes to the question of whether we should be financing their wars?
I think the primary difference is what is being asked for in these conflicts. So if you look at Russia's history with Ukraine, what is being asked for is normalization of trade, relationship between Ukrainian leadership and Russia. And there's tons of historical record that show that Russia has been attempting to create a trade route, an access point to the Black Sea. And there's a reasonableness there that I think that most people can objectively say this war could have been avoided. I think when you look at what's been going on in Israel and Gaza, and you talk to Israelis, they've been fired at by Hamas for so many years. And you talk to the average Israeli who's in their 40s, and they've been now drafted into so many different wars. And October 7th is very different than, and I'm just speaking morally, October 2nd had a very different effect on the consciousness of humanity. And I think that there was certainly, most people would agree that a response was necessary based on the October 7th attack. There was reprehensible behavior. But I think where the majority of people are in their consciousness at this moment as well is very much wishing for greater restraint from Israel, which has an incredibly sophisticated army compared to Hamas's. And I think that given the complexity of the region, and again, the U.S. has contributed a lot to exacerbating this complexity, that there is fundamental differences between these two wars. But that being said, neither one needs to continue as it has been currently. And there are paths to de-escalation available that this administration is fully incapable of executing on right now.
Let me just switch gears a little bit. When your selection as vice president's candidate was announced, there was a lot of discourse suggesting or claiming that one of the reasons, if not the main reason for your selection, was that you have a great ability to self-finance a independent campaign. And I'm somebody who has long said that the way in which the two parties have constructed this kind of duopoly means that the only way you could succeed as an independent candidate is if you have kind of a billionaire on the ticket who can fund the campaign. But nonetheless, I just want to understand, do you acknowledge, I mean, was that part of the conversation when, as part of the selection process, was whether or not you were willing to donate money? And how much money do you intend to donate to this campaign? Do you know?
I can't give you an exact dollar amount. We're in June right now. June historically for independent candidates has been very challenging. That's usually when the other two parties really ramp up their PR and media spend. And most of that media spend typically goes towards taking out the independent candidate first and then, their opposing party candidate. I am of the belief that this is an election unlike any other. We have a standing president running for re-election who is clearly showing signs of rapid decline. We have another president who was just recently convicted of a felony. And, we've got now an independent candidate who is the only outspoken public figure during a pandemic that was calling out origins of a virus and calling out government officials. And it's proving true in this moment that he was entirely correct. So my involvement, and I feel like my responsibility right now being on this ticket, is to first and foremost make sure he's on every single ballot. And I will contribute as much as it takes to make that a reality.
I totally respect that. I understand that argument. And like I said, I'm somebody who in the past has said, if you want to be an independent candidate, if you want to challenge the two parties, unfortunately, the only way to do that is if you have somebody in one or the other slots who basically is a billionaire and can self-finance the campaign to compete with the two parties, because that's how they've constructed the system. I'm just wondering, though, when people look at your selection and our political system in general, which you had no role in creating, but the idea that very wealthy people obviously have a much bigger say than ordinary Americans in exerting power in Washington and how laws are passed. Do you regard the role of big money in politics, and you've been a big donor for political candidates for quite some time, do you regard the role of big money in politics as a major problem for democracy? And if so, what kind of reforms would you support?
I think it's a huge problem. I think Citizens United turned this country into a kleptocracy overnight. And I believe that individual donors should certainly have limits, and that independents should be free to run without having to spend this kind of money. The ballot requirements that we've seen are arbitrary and ludicrous. Each state is different. Their requirements are crushing. We have an enormous legal team just to deal with that piece. And, the thing that has made me really excited is I recently met with somebody at an organization called American Promise, and they are going state by state to try to pass a constitutional amendment that would set contribution limits for both individuals and corporations. 22 states have endorsed it, and it seems to be something that Americans want, and by a large margin of the population. I mean, this is the grand majority of Americans want there to be limits, and I am one of them.
You referenced earlier the recent conviction in the Manhattan courtroom of the former President Donald Trump. Today, as I don't know if you heard, but before we're speaking to you, I was talking about the order compelling Steve Bannon, the president's former top White House official, to appear and surrender to a federal prison on July 1st for contempt of Congress charges, a charge for which people are very rarely imprisoned. Do you see the prosecution of Trump on these specific charges, the one about the accounting irregularities for hush fund payments, and the other prosecutions of so many people around the Trump orbit, as a vindication of the rule of law? Or do you think it's an example of Democrats and others in the establishment weaponizing the justice system to attack their political enemies?
There's been evidence from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party using the judicial system and the Department of Justice against political opponents. We have become so divided and polarized in this country that there is no branch of government that hasn't somehow been corrupted by these party lines. It is... I think that they've both been guilty. You can point at many areas where, Republicans have done similar things and Democrats have done similar, no greater example is what happened to President Trump. But the case itself, if you are just objectively looking at how the case was conducted, this is a hush money trial that didn't have the correct jury instructions in the hands of the jury. And there were just so many things about it that make you really call into question the objectivity of the Justice Department in this moment. And that is, the Justice Department has always been the last resort. It's been that last layer of defense in protecting our civil liberties in this country, normalcy in this country, objectivity, the rule of law. And to have it be toyed with in this way, to have it be manipulated and distorted, I think is the number one thing. It's kind of the last straw for many people in this country that raise that flag, that alarm that we've slipped into an autocratic environment where rule of law is really no longer the rule of law, but rule of the parties. It's incredibly concerning on so many levels, and I think it has a ripple effect as well.
So I referenced earlier the history that you've had as a big dollar donor in politics. From what I can tell, maybe I'm wrong, but the overwhelming majority of your big dollar donations, if not all of them, have gone to Democratic Party candidates, including both kind of mainstream centrist types like Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign, Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign, but also even
Marianne Williamson.
I was about to say her. That even causes and people associated with the left. And I was going to say exactly Marianne Williamson, you supported, as well as kind of the reform-minded prosecutors, including in San Francisco, which is kind of a criminal justice reform cause often associated with the left, although Donald Trump was the first president to sign a criminal justice reform in a long time. Nonetheless, you were donating to Democrats, kind of classic Democrats. You were a registered member of the Democratic Party until this year when you were going to run as an independent. You alluded earlier to President Biden's obvious rapid decline in cognitive function and ability. But is that all that concerns you about Biden and the Democrats, or is there anything else or other things that have caused you to change your mind about the Democratic Party?
To be completely honest with you, Biden's health is secondary to the enormous, and secondary by a long margin from the enormity of the corruption I've seen in the party. So in 2020, I didn't support Biden. I supported Hillary, kind of not with enthusiasm, but
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just to interrupt. In 2020, Hillary ran against Bernie in 2016, and that was Bernie and Biden in 2020 when Hillary didn't run. So I'm sure you just misspoke.
Correct. But no, sorry. I was referencing 2016 when I supported Hillary Clinton, and in 2020, I supported Marianne Williamson, but it was 2020 that I realized that the Democratic primary had been completely broken. I knew that Bernie was likely to win the primary in 2016. In fact, I think he won, and that was the first real big crack in the DNC that I saw. And in 2020, it was truly very obvious that there was no more Democratic primary. No one could run a fair shot at beating the central Democratic dynastic line. And it was very clear that Biden was the only one who was going to get a shot at getting on the ticket. My experience, I mean, this would take hours and hours to unpack, but I've had such excruciatingly disappointing experiences with the leadership of the Democrats. I've heard things said to me. I've seen things done that are incredibly contradictory. They're really pathetic in terms of what the party cares about and prioritizes. There's been almost no interest in addressing the root causes of many of this country's biggest issues, including chronic disease, including budgetary adjustments that need to be made. They throw around money. They want to win at all costs. Once they win, they're not focused on the American people. They are focused on these auxiliary functions of government. And it's very clear that they have built up this enormous kleptocracy in our agencies. And there was no way for me to be able to continue to take any of it seriously. I couldn't support it anymore. And you said I've previously supported many progressive DAs. I've also recalled DAs as well that didn't do their jobs. The first DA I supported was actually a former police chief, and he did a pretty good job in San Francisco.
That was George Gershon, right? That was George Gershon.
George Gascon.
Oh, yeah,
he was a police chief, a very much liked police officer. He ran on bringing balance to the system and communication and partnership between the DA's office and the police department. But he also wanted to create trust and make sure that there was no bias that could be called into question. And he wanted to make sure that the police department had a lot of integrity and trust.
Yeah, I did think it was interesting, the donation to Marianne Williamson, in part because her major critique is aimed at least as much as at the Democratic Party as the Republican Party. She often sounds like more of an independent candidate, criticizing both parties than she did like a Democrat. So I thought that was one of the more interesting donations. A lot of times when people who kind of come from the Democratic Party become very disappointed in the Democratic Party, come to kind of see them as pathetic, as you said. I empathize a lot with that trajectory. A lot of people who kind of come down that path to the point where they don't even want to support Democrats anymore, still kind of in the back of their mind believe that at the end of the day, Democrats are still a little bit better than the Republicans, in this case, I guess, especially under Donald Trump. Is that a view that you share, that if there were no independent candidate, if there were only Democrats and Republicans, that people should vote for the Democratic Party? Or are you not even prepared to say that one is better than the other at this point?
I think that there is a clear uniparty, and nothing makes that more obvious than the way Congress came together in this last session. There is no way that I could swing over and support Donald Trump. I know too much about his record. He had a Raytheon lobbyist running the Secretary of Defense. He had his loyalists, which represented all kinds of corporate interests, fill his cabinet. He hasn't blinked twice about the fact that he was responsible for Operation Warp Speed, had enabled Fauci very blindly to go ahead and conduct the pandemic response. He intentionally pulled the investigation on Pfizer. It was there. He's done so many things that, that are just as pitiful as the Democratic Party has done. I like Liberty Republicans. I think that if there's some future where the two-party system returns to any sense of sanity, I could see myself becoming a Liberty Republican alongside individuals like, I think Thomas Massie has done great things for this country. I think that Ron Paul's done incredible things for this country. I think Rand Paul has been really fighting the good fight for this country. And then I also see some good progressive, I think Dean Phillips has done some very good and interesting things as well. So there's still signs that the two parties can be salvaged. I don't know that we get there, though, if we just keep doing these huge swings. And my theory right now is that Trump is peaking, in large part due to the help of the Democrats and the general understanding in America that the judicial system has been corrupted to support Democrats in this election by prosecuting Trump, but that backfired on them. He's raised over $100 million since the conviction.
I just have a couple more questions in the little bit of time that we have left. I want to respect your time. So I have a lot of questions I'd love for you to come back on. But for now, I want to ask you about this. Since 2016, when there was this sort of trauma to the system of the establishment, Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton, but also Brexit, there's been this kind of systematic attempt to gain control over the kind of information and speech that is permitted to flow on the internet. There have been governments around the world, including our own government and our intelligence agencies, who have created excuses to either censor the internet directly or to coerce big tech platforms to do it for them. Usually the justifications are things like, well, we have to combat disinformation, as if the government can decree truth and falsity, or we have to combat hate speech or things that are some kind of a threat to our national security. Where do you fall in that debate? Do you believe that there are any reasons that government or big tech should be censoring political speech on the internet, other than in obvious cases where crimes are being committed, like fraud or things like that? But when it comes to political speech, do you support the censorship or suppression of any of those views?
You can't love this country and also support the censorship. I love this country very deeply. I love this country because of the Constitution. In part, went to law school because of the fact that I believe so deeply in the power of the Constitution to protect individual liberties. And I believe these basic liberties, such as freedom of speech, are what make this country the country that it is, a country of hope, a country of honor, a country of innovation, a country of living out one's dream. The censorship that has occurred since 2016, especially with the use of AI to censor speech automatically, and these large language models, which are programmed specifically to demarcate categories of speech that will be automatically banned. It has been one of the reasons why I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley right now. I have decided to rebel against Silicon Valley. Part of me joining Bobby Kennedy's ticket is this rebellion. Bobby Kennedy has been censored more than any political candidate in my lifetime that I'm aware of. And I have joined this ticket in part because I am an insider. I know how this happened. I saw it happen. I know why it's happened, and I know exactly how to unwind it. And if given the opportunity, I will, on, my first opportunity, go into these agencies and take out and disable all of these AI sensors. I will also understand the exact points of government capture of the corporations and of the big tech platforms. They have, it's not, you use the word coerce. It's a combination of coercion and knowing and willful partnership. And I've seen it.
Yeah, that is interesting that you kind of come from it with that perspective, and so much of the censorship is done by AI. All right, last question. When I had Bobby Kennedy on my show, he said that one of the things he would support almost immediately is pardoning both Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, both of whom are essentially have been turned into dissidents for the crime of exposing the crimes of the secret part of our government, the U.S. security state. Do you agree with that position? And more importantly, how do you see the dangers posed by that part of our government that has no democratic accountability, that works in complete secrecy, that's independent of any party change that we might vote for, the CIA, the NSA? How do you see that part of the government?
It's Ron Paul said it in his Libertarian Convention speech that there was a coup when JFK was assassinated, and I don't think there's any candidate in history that is going to be able to unravel the shadow government more than Bobby Kennedy Jr. can and will do. I am fully supportive of the need for that. I think that it is critical to reclaim this nation as a free and stable republic. Assange is a hero. I think that what he has done through this broader cypherpunk movement is to protect the internet, which is where most Americans, and especially young Americans, are living out their lives today. It is the forum of engagement, of exchanging information, of building companies and building coalitions. And if the internet is not a free place for people to be able to expose and have conversations about what is going on with their governments, then we've lost the most dominant speech we have, which is, the speech that we have over digital platforms. So I believe Assange is 100% a hero, and it is so necessary. Trump had a chance to do it and he didn't. And I don't understand why he didn't, because to me, it's one of the most obvious and easy decisions he could have made was to pardon Assange. Snowden is a whistleblower. We are a country that has historically protected overseas whistleblowers. Why do we prosecute our own? It's incredibly hypocritical.
Well, Ms. Shanahan, you gave us a lot of your time. I found the conversation very interesting. We'd love to have you back on at some point in the future, and I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It was nice to meet you as well.
You too. Have a good evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.